So thanks everyone for coming here today. Marina Van Koughnett is someone that I worked with a lot at TransAlta before I left and came to BC. She was very integral in pitching and selling process safety or ops integrity as a program that was implemented at TransAlta. And like I said earlier in some of our previous meetings, the bow tie analysis and method was a big part of how critical risks were identified within that group, and then how process safety and the controls were implemented across the organization. I had a brief conversation with Marina, and she indicated and talked about some of the successes that they'd sought, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity for this group to hear what they did, how they learned from it, the approach that they took, and the benefits that they're getting from it. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Marina.
Great, thank you, Sherry. So today, let me just make sure I can move the presentation along. There we go. Today, this is sort of the order of topics in which I'd like to talk about and share with you. At TransAlta, it's tradition for us to start every discussion with a safety moment, so we'll open with one of those. Then I'll introduce you to the Ops Integrity program that we stood up, which is our process safety program. Talk a little bit about the benefits that we've realized now that we're into our sustainment mode, and then transition a little bit to, okay, where are you guys at as a group? And in talking with other companies that I know of that have gone down similar journeys, what might be some of the options in terms of next steps? Where could you go, and what options are maybe available? Just help give you some ideas. And then I'll finish up with some lessons learned. I'll try to keep the whole thing under sort of 40 minutes, ideally, so that we've got some time for some question and some dialogue here at the end. So I wanted to start with a process safety moment, and I wanted to tackle this incident in particular that happened in BC in 2017 at a hockey arena. So the incident in question happened in their chiller system, so the system that they use to cool the slab so that the ice will stay and remain during the winter hockey season. And essentially what ended up happening was the tubes that contained the ammonia, they ended up leaking. And there was also a compromise in the brine tube. So the ammonia got into the brine. When they combined, it caused a bit of an overpressure, and then it caused a much more significant release of ammonia into the mechanical maintenance room where the chiller system was located. There was enough ammonia that actually residents in the local area were smelling it and phoning police and fire departments. And the arena did have an alarm for ammonia leaks in the maintenance room, and 3 arena workers did indeed go in and try to investigate the leak itself. First responders, when they arrived on site as a result of the phone calls they'd been getting from local residents, they went into the mechanical room, quickly saw that there was a leak, saw that there was sort of like a press here in case of emergency type button. They activated that button, and that actually led to worsening the situation. It dumped the rest of the ammonia out of the system and into the air. So the net result of this incident, was that there were 3 fatalities. So unfortunately, the 3 arena workers that went in to respond to the alarm all succumbed. And there was so much ammonia in the environment that 95 residents had to be evacuated from their homes for 8 days. So very, very significant in terms of incident. But let's see what we can learn from it. So the first thing I'm going to pull up here, this is just visual of the Swiss cheese model. Hopefully folks are somewhat familiar with it. Really, it just sort of simply goes in to state that in order for a major accident like what we just witnessed in a facility to exist, it usually has to compromise multiple layers of protection. Some of those layers can be technology barriers, so protection systems, pipe thickness, that type of thing, your equipment and what condition it's in. Some of them will be process barriers, such as how about you go about maintaining your assets, operating them. Some of them will be people barriers, so the knowledge, the training, the competency, the decision-making of the individuals in question. So let's examine this particular instance from that perspective. So looking at it from a technology sort of plant and equipment standpoint, a few things came out in the investigation. The first thing was right from day one, the building, unfortunately, the design of the ventilation system was not adequate. So it would not have been able to expel adequate amounts of the ammonia in the case of a leak. The other unfortunate thing right at the design stage of the building was that the vent placements for the ventilation system was not appropriate. The vents that actually took the air from inside the building and vented them out were right next to the intake. So the air would go out and then circulate right back into the building. And in this case, the ammonia discharge system, the emergency system, actually did more to worsen the situation than it actually did to try and help contain it or manage it. From a process standpoint, the city had known that this equipment, this chiller system, was at its end of life. They'd been notified of that by some maintenance contractors that they brought in. They had actually gone in and allocated funding to replace the chillers, but that had been deferred a couple of times, and then it just simply stopped appearing in their sort of long-range plans. Not obvious as to why that came off or whether that was an oversight. Secondly, there was no formal risk assessment process to support the decision making. So either in terms of their capital planning and the decisions to defer things, but also it came to be known that the arena itself had identified the ammonia leak in the spring. They decided to not do anything about it, but to try and address it during their major sort of plant maintenance before the winter season started up. They again identified that there was a leak and still chose to put the system in place. So again, decision-making challenges there. And finally, lack of awareness and documentation of plant hazards. It was pretty clear in that situation that there weren't necessarily documented procedures for what to do in case of ammonia leaks, and or the individuals in question who were working at the arena didn't necessarily recognize or understand the hazards associated with that and how to properly respond. So that leads to people failures, right? There was lack of competency and training and knowledge on behalf of the people involved in this circumstance. And that led to poor decisions, both from an asset investment standpoint and from a return to service in terms of the equipment given its condition. So process safety, the reason we embark on these types of journeys and these improvements is exactly to avoid these types of scenarios and circumstances that unfortunately can happen. So before I go into our journey, I wanted to introduce you a little bit to TransAlta to give you some context as to who we are. So we are a power generation company. We have coal assets, gas assets, wind, hydro. Interesting thing to note, if you see that sort of a circle chart that shows how much of our energy is actually produced by coal, just sort of an interesting fact, we're in the process of converting all of that coal to gas. So we're undergoing some pretty significant changes as a business right now. And geographically, we have primarily our presence is in Canada, but we do have a presence in the United States and also in Western Australia as well. Just a quick map of our business. Again, you can see we're heavily focused in Alberta and Ontario in terms of our presence in Canada, but we do have some assets elsewhere, including in BC. So I wanted to start out with what's our impetus for change? So very rarely do people go on a journey unless there's something, some driver, some motivation to do it. And I find it interesting now looking back that in actual fact, our impetus for change, or what my driver was working in the business to try and make something different, was actually our desire as an organization to grow. And in order to grow, we needed to improve our cash to support the growth. We needed cash to balance our books, our financials, reset our debt to earnings ratio so that we could get better financing. And we physically wanted to get more money from our assets in order to be able to reinvest that in growth as well, so we wouldn't have to finance everything. The challenges were that we had unpredictable cash from our generation business. So we had unplanned equipment failures that were resulting in unbudgeted spend, continual, reassessing of what are we going to do in the year now that we don't have, now that we have these unplanned events, how are we going to manage it within our budgets? And our costs in general, we knew that they weren't in line with benchmarking. So it's interesting. I was obviously a bit naive at the time, not recognizing that some of these unplanned equipment failures and stuff actually had a parallel with process safety. But this was really the main driver. And so we went out looking for solutions that would help to address some of these challenges that we had as a business. And we came across a company called Scottish Power. And Scottish Power, they had gone in and implemented a program that helped them to get some of the core principles of asset management, which is now ISO 55000. They'd integrated in aspects of their occupational health, safety, and environmental program, and some of the core foundational concepts of risk management. And that was really appealing to me in particular, because I was thinking, geez, we've got a business challenge, and here's some frameworks that, especially the ISO 55000, that help us to address the business challenge. But again, as to my comment earlier, we're having all that unpredictable equipment failure. And what Scottish Power came to realize, and they unfortunately had realized a pretty major process safety incident, is that yes, those things are important and they help improve your business. But really, if you look at these different standards, there's some clear overlap here where they come together, and that really, that confluence of where they come together is really the crux of process safety. And so they flipped it around and they said, actually, we have a process safety issue. We've experienced a major process safety incident, and we're going to use process safety to come in and help us to drive a behavior change across our entire organization. And the side benefit will be that we'll implement core elements of ISO 55000 and risk management and occupational health and safety and environmental. We'll be able to bring them together into one sort of integrated program and realize some business benefits as a result. And I'll share with you a little bit about what some of our benefits have been as a result of going down this journey, aside from just our improvement on the safety side as well. So we went in and we decided, okay, yes, this is the right approach for us to take. We should be centering ourselves on process safety. Other benefits come as a result. And so what we did was we merged our occupational health and safety program with our ops integrity program, which was really our sort of vehicle for implementing process safety in our organization. And we consolidated them in under one management system that we've coined our total safety management system at TransAlta, TSMS for short. And that's what we have and what we operate under now. So I'm going to talk today about our program in the context of our mission statement. So when we first started down this path, we set out as a mission to get to a future where we understood our hazards, where we have systems in place to control our hazards, we have assurance that our systems are in control, and we're able to make informed decisions on cost, performance, and risk. So that's the foundational principles and philosophy behind the program that we stood up and the approach that we took. And we didn't invent this. This was very heavily, actually, it came from Scottish Power, who we'd been engaging with to learn about their journey and their experience. And it had also been a very, very key influence in terms of how they went about creating and supporting the drafting of legislation in the UK. These are kind of the same kind of common principles and philosophies that you'll find in their legislation. So let's examine our program under those four goals of our mission statement. So the first one was to understand our hazards. So the first thing we had to do was identify, okay, what are those process safety hazards, those types of major accidents, as we've termed them, that we want to avoid. And we went through and identified those, and those became the top events or the center events in the bow ties that we then went on and developed. And taking this approach also allowed us to start answering the second question, which was to say that we have systems in place to control our hazards. Because once we had the hazards, part of building the bow tie out is identifying, okay, what threats or initiating circumstances could cause you to realize that? And then what controls do you have in your business, or do you need to put into your business in order to avoid realizing those major accident hazards? So we went through that exercise. We built out bow ties for all of our fuel types. And then we took those bow tie barriers and we recognized, actually Scottish Power again recognized, that, you know, you can consolidate, you can look through all of the bow ties that you have, and we've got many in our company. And you can take each of those barriers, and they each line up to sort of a barrier type, if you will. And so we identified all the different barrier types that existed within our bow ties, and they get mapped down here against what we've been referring to as our risk control framework. So what you see here is essentially a representation in some logical groupings for us as to what types of barriers that we need to have in our business healthy and functioning in order for us to avoid those major accident hazards. From there, that gave us a good framework against which we could benchmark our performance to try and see, okay, where are we performing well today, and where do we have some gaps or some weaknesses that we really need to address, and what priority order should we focus on addressing those. So we did that exercise. We went in, we benchmarked ourselves, we tested ourselves against ISO 31000, ISO 55000, process safety legislation in the UK, against occupational health and safety and the environmental standards, to come in and really get an understanding of, okay, where are we? Where do we have challenges? And once we were able to uncover where we had those challenges against this framework, then that allowed us to stand up a program to go in and implement improvements, be they system, tool, process, knowledge, improvements in our business to try and make sure that each of these barrier types was properly addressed and functioning in an adequate way for our business. So the next piece of our mission statement is to make sure we have assurance that those systems are in control, right? So we've got those processes in, they're stood up, they're functioning, but how do we make sure that they're functioning to the degree that we need them to in order to avoid process safety incidents? So we've got a couple different mechanisms here that we've been using within the company. First thing is we have a Target Zero committee. So Target Zero is essentially our governance body. It's made up of all of our senior operations leaders. They come together on a monthly basis. We look at trends, analysis of incidents that we've had, and to try and make assessments as to where the program is functioning adequately and where it's not. We have a process safety dashboard, which you see sort of a image capture of here on the right. And really what that does is it's a series of KPIs or measurement points that are going out and measuring all of those processes and how well they're functioning. So every process that we made an improvement to or a change to or that we deemed to be critical to process safety, we tried to implement KPIs for to measure how well they're functioning. And that dashboard is fully automated and fully embedded into our businesses when they go in and do business reviews to see how well they're operating. And the final thing we did was we took what used to be just our occupational health and safety audit program, and we expanded that to cover off the entire breadth of our new total safety management system. So we go out and we actually do full-blown audits to make sure that the processes at each of our plants are complying to those standards that we've put into place. And we do that on a 3-year rotating basis. So every 3 years, each plant will get a audit, but every year we also cover off each fuel type so that we can get a sense as to how each part of our business is functioning in general. And finally, the last statement, we're able to make informed decisions on cost, performance, and risk. So this was crucial, and it's interesting that it shows up as sort of the last statement on the mission because it was actually one of the first things that we did. When we started down this journey, we had 16 or 17 different risk matrices, which meant that when a leader was faced with a decision as to where to put resources, be they dollar resources or people resources or other things, they'd have different groups coming to them and making an argument as to why their area deserved the investment more than others. But they were all using different bases for that assessment. And so it really put leaders in a position where they were not really able to rely on the assessments coming to them. They were end up having to rely on personal judgment, which is biased by their personal experiences, maybe the areas that they know more about. And so we didn't have consistent decision-making, nor did we have truly risk-based decision-making. So one of the first things that we did was create a single risk framework for the business off which we could start basing our decision-making. And then we went through and embedded that into all of our key processes, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So this program was, it wasn't small. Once we did our audit, we ended up coming up with about 26 areas that we felt that we needed to make improvements. We did implement this across our entire business. And just to give you a sense of some of the types of work that we actually drove, I haven't listed them all here, but I'll list and share with you just a few. So I've mentioned this a few times. We did take and expand our management system and move to an integrated management system. We did do bow ties. So we developed bow ties for each of our facilities. We developed 62 engineering standards. So it's not to say we didn't have engineering standards before, we did, but we went in, and as a result of having the bow ties, we were able to identify which systems were our protection systems and really go back and make sure that our standards covered those off and set the minimum expectations with regards to how we're going to maintain and operate those. So we went through and redeveloped and released those. We implemented an asset criticality system so we could understand what equipment we had in our plant and what kind of impact that equipment had on our business. If you had a process safety impact, environmental impact, maybe it had no impact to those, but was very impactful in terms of heat rate, so plant efficiency or availability. For those assets that we identified as high criticality, so the ones that had a process safety implication, primarily protection systems, we went in and we did maintenance strategies for them. So we reassessed the maintenance program that we had to make sure that they were in fact meeting or exceeding the minimum that we'd articulated in our engineering standards. We changed some of our operations practices and standards, specifically around bypass management, alarm management, impairment, and logbook and shift handover. We developed and released a competency management framework. Again, we put a lot of time and effort into developing a single risk framework for the business. We built out and automated our process safety dashboard so everyone in our business could go in and see how we're performing against those core processes. And we stood up an integrated audit program as well. So has it been worth it? Hopefully you can get a sense of the scope and the breadth of the program that we put into place. It was a lot of effort, and it definitely required some investment, not just in terms of time and energy, but also in terms of money. So let me share with you some of the benefits that we've seen now that we're a couple of years out and into sustainment and continuous improvement. So our TIF, total injury frequency, has dropped 67%. Now, in honor of transparency, I do want to make sure that everyone realizes that not all of our TIF incidents were process safety incidents. And also in the last 2 years, year and a half, 2 years, we've also significantly expanded our behavioral safety program. So I can't say that this 67% reduction was solely based on the process safety program that we put into place, but it definitely had an impact. In terms of our that unreliable equipment that I was talking about before, our incidents that resulted in a loss, so a business impact, like financial impact, reduced by 66%. Our environmental incidents reduced by 30%, and our regulatory incidents reduced by 41%. So some pretty, gives me kind of goosebumps. I like looking at these slides, but it just goes to show that, yes, the journey will go and it will get you there and it will improve your process safety, but it also helps to improve your business. And in my opinion, looking at those stats, yeah, it was worth it. So I wanted to switch gears now and sort of talk a little bit about where you're at and allow you to sort of leverage maybe a bit on some of the conversations I've had with different companies that have gone down similar journeys and similar experiences to kind of help you maybe think through what steps might come next in terms of your journeys to process safety. So I understand from Sherry, and she sent me a link, I've taken a quick look at your bow ties. So you've gone in and you've identified what the hazards are, at least for the wood pellet industry. So that's a really good first step towards meeting that first objective if you were to measure yourself against the program that we've stood up. And you've taken a good first step too in building out those bow ties in terms of identifying the barriers that you need to have in place to make sure that you can avoid those major accident hazards. So some really good first steps, definitely. But let's explore where you could go now. So I've pulled up a screenshot. This is a partial view of actually one of the bow ties that you guys have worked through and developed. And I'm going to just pick, for argument's sake, a barrier here. So in this case, it's an ID fan interlock with auto shutdown, right? So it's a protection system in terms of a barrier type. There's a couple different ways that you could go about tackling it, and I've seen different companies go about tackling implementation of the bow ties. One is to go in and take a very discrete approach to managing the barriers. So that's to say, okay, we've identified that we have to have specifically an ID fan interlock with an auto shutdown. Now that's a requirement, and we're going to go and test for that in all of the facilities, right? that has to be in place, and we have to understand how it's being maintained, what maintenance is against that, to make sure that it's going to function as intended when it's called upon. Proof testing, essentially. Proof testing and maintenance. So that's a very discrete approach, and certainly there are companies that have gone in there and said, yeah, we've identified the very specific barrier and we're going to manage to that. TransAlta took a slightly different approach. We went with more of a programmatic approach. So we went in and we said, okay, yes, there's a barrier. In this case, it's ID found, but we would have said, okay, that's a protection system. We need to stand up a program to try and address all of our protection systems, and we need a program to be able to help us identify what systems are protection systems, as opposed to going through explicitly in the bow ties and going, bow tie by bow tie, line by line, and identifying that. So we took that approach and that methodology, and then we drafted standards for how we're going to manage each of those bow ties, and then drove fleet-wide implementation programs so that we would have one way of addressing those types of barriers across our entire business. The other approach I've seen, which is a bit more hands-off, some companies have chosen to say, okay, sort of like the programmatic approach, yes, we're going to identify barrier types, and we're going to come together and we're going to develop standards or documents that we're going to, identify as good practice as to how to manage those barriers or what a minimum requirement might be like. But then it's up to each individual facility within that company or within that organizational group or each fuel type, depends on how they set themselves up, to go and figure out how they're going to go and meet or exceed that minimum practice or that good practice that's been identified. And also it's up to them to decide which areas they're going to tackle as individual local business groups and in what order. So they're sort of in full control of their own destiny in terms of figuring out how to go through and drive an implementation. Again, TransAlta, we chose to go with more of a programmatic approach. And just thinking in terms of you guys being as an industry group, that might be that, or the sort of more directional approach might be a bit easier and more palatable. So I took a cut at trying to talk about a little bit of the pros and cons for each of the different approaches, because there are pros and cons to each one. With the discrete approach, that's going in and identifying each individual barrier and figuring out exactly what you're going to do, what the requirements are going to be for that specific barrier. It becomes very easy to go in and identify, okay, as a business or as a plant, what is my risk of having that specific major accident hazard? And for high risk, high hazard industries, I think of like chemical industries, nuclear in terms of power generation, that can be very important to be able to go in and very specifically, discreetly identify, yes, this is the barrier, this is what's expected, and this is how I'm managing it, as opposed to stepping it back and taking a more programmatic approach. Downsides are, it's you're focusing your efforts on just those specific barriers, so you don't get an opportunity to address broader equipment or process issues. And so sometimes the benefits are more localized and specific to avoiding process safety. It's a higher level of effort, definitely, to implement and develop and sustain. This was the path actually originally when we first set out on the program that we thought we were going to take. And we ended up revising our course to go with more of a program approach. The programmatic approach, so again, it's a little bit less effort to develop a program. It's easier to chunk the work out into individual projects or improvement areas that you want to do and actually drive and deliver them, especially at a company level, because you can go in and develop standards for those barrier types. And then if you want to, you can even go in and stand up projects to implement them across a facility or a plant, or excuse me, even a fleet. And it does help you to address issues that go sort of slightly beyond just that sort of process safety benefit. Cons, for really high risk industries, I don't think that this would be adequate. And unless you audit the bow tie themselves when you go to the plants, it's very hard to go in and say, this is the specific major accident and this is the specific risk to having that major accident in question. You can talk about your program and your overall risk of having process safety incidents and the quality of your barriers and thus the likelihood of having them, but you can't zone in on that individual major accident hazard in question. In terms of the directional approach, So some of the pros, I think personally it's probably easier from an industry group or a lot of companies where they seem to get challenges in terms of getting everyone to move in the same direction at the same time. There seems to be a decentralized control. Definitely probably an easier approach to take. The other advantage is there's already a lot of good practices out there articulated in ISO standards and other places. So it's not that difficult to go in and identify what good looks like. And it enables each company to go in and manage their own implementation, but still create sort of like a community group where you've identified those good practices where you can come together and help each other out through the journey and learn from each other. Cons are, again, it's not specific. Some companies, some groups may struggle with how generic it is in terms of, well, that's great that that's a good practice, but how do I actually go about implementing that in my company? There might be a loss of implementation synergies in the sense that if you're doing it within a company, if you took a programmatic approach and everybody was working on using the same tools, the same processes, there might be some financial synergies there and efficiencies that you can gain. So moving on, continuing to examine the mission statement. Excuse me. If we look at the next statement, assurance that our systems are in control, let's talk through that a little bit. So I've got a bit of a cartoon. I'll just pause here and give everyone a quick second to sort of read that. So hopefully what you've got from that is, you've got one group saying, look at these fantastic benefits that we've got. And someone is saying, yeah, but what I really cared about was EBITDA. What was the impact on EBITDA, right? So if you don't measure it, it doesn't get managed. And I think the same thing is very true with programs and implementations. Measurement becomes very important. The other thing in terms of providing assurance is I do believe that there needs to be governance in place. Entropy is the natural state. I know within TransAlta we've had many programs in our past history where we've gone and implemented, did a great job on the implementation part, but we didn't invest enough time, energy, and effort into sustainment. And as a result, over a period of a couple of years, those programs fell apart. And we lost the benefit. We didn't sustain the benefits that we'd brought back into the business. And the same is true with the process safety program. You can put all your time into planning and doing the work, but if you don't think about how you're going to check your performance and act accordingly to drive that continuous improvement, you're not going to sustain the value. So you're going to put this big investment of time and energy in and not maintain that over time. So regardless of what approach you take, I really do firmly believe that you need to have some structure there in terms of governance. You need some forms of measurement, and you do need a formal governance body stood up to try and make sure that you can sustain and continuously improve those types of programs. A lot of the organizations, actually almost all of the ones that I've talked to, going back to that point about measurement, have put reporting in place with KPIs. Now, especially with technology and all the emphasis on data and data quality and data management and all the rest of it, it's certainly a lot easier to go in and create automated performance dashboards that measure your processes. And I would highly recommend going that direction. It allows your business to spend less time on trying to report what you're doing and how well you're doing it, and more time identifying, okay, what do we do about our performance? Is it good enough? Do we need to make some more investments? What do we think is driving those trends and those results? Again, audits, auditing can be sometimes a bit dry and a bit boring, but it's really important. And especially if you can stand up a program that's going to help across multiple facilities, it also creates a great platform for learning and sharing and driving continuous improvement. So there's other benefits that come from driving audits, as well as making sure that there's that minimum compliance. And finally, you do need to have the governance, and it needs to come from senior leaders. Otherwise, their decision-making is going to get influenced, and it's going to influence the degree to which your program is able to be sustained and the value that you get from it. And it's also going to impact your implementation and how well that actually succeeds. So some things to consider. Don't have to necessarily stand up a management system. Some companies do, some companies don't to sustain it. Just please look at your company, your past experiences, and talk with other companies and find out what has worked and what hasn't worked to help whatever you invest in to sustain the test of time. And that's probably a true comment regardless of whether it's process safety or any other program that you're going to embark on. Again, I personally have a belief that programs and processes tend to come and go. I've seen that happen a few times. So I do have a tendency to lean towards more of management systems. I think there's a better understanding that with a management system comes some of that governance component that I think is so critical. And the other thing is that I've learned is if you can embed the governance into how you run your business, it's a lot more successful. So process safety, instead of it being something you do, like you have your business reviews and you talk about, financial performance, the rest of it, and then everyone sets that aside, and then you turn your focus and your attention to process safety. It's okay, now how's our process safety program running? Well, they're kind of one and the same, right? It needs to become the new way that you run your business. And so if you can invest or change and take some of those process safety governance elements and embed them into your business governance, so your monthly meetings, your weekly meetings, your group meetings, whatever that looks like for you, personally, I believe that you'll have a much higher likelihood of success, and it'll become more embedded in terms of this is how I run my business, as opposed to here's how I run my business. Oh, and we do this as well. So that brings us down to the final point. How do you go about making informed decisions on cost, performance, and risk? So I think I've mentioned this before. I'm a big believer in using your risk framework as your common decision-making basis. If you've got it structured right, your consequence categories really are those things that are really important to your business. They're essentially your business drivers. And having your risk framework set up properly and your matrix in particular, it helps give leaders an understanding, when they're making decisions about where to invest, where to focus people, where to prioritize time and effort, as to what kinds of impacts the business views as equivalent to each other. So, do I prioritize a customer intervention issue here with regulatory? Like, what point do I prioritize one over the other? Or what point are they equal? And it helps get people away from that sort of personal decision making and move them to more of a consistent company-wide approach to how you make decisions and how you end up prioritizing all types of resources, including your finances. The other note that I like to mention here is I think all too often people hear risk and they think of the negative. I'm trying to avoid a bad thing from happening in my company, and they view risk matrices as only being a support in terms of helping them to make decisions about what to avoid. But there's two sides to the risk coin, right? There's the negative and the positive, and we use our risk framework as well to help us evaluate, where to make an investment, right? Oh, well, this will have a benefit in terms of improvement here versus this other one will have a smaller benefit, but maybe it's across more of these consequence categories. So it helps guide those decisions as well. There's a lot of resources out there. There's a couple here. The Asset Management Standard talks about the importance of decision-making and aligning your decision-making. In ISO 31000 goes into a bit more detail as to how you might develop your risk framework. There's a lot of other resources out there, needless to say, but I really do think this is an absolutely crucial part of standing up any type of a process safety program like this. And the other thing too is it's not just enough to have a single risk framework, but I really think it's important from a process safety standpoint to go in and identify where are decisions going to be made that are going to influence the effectiveness of your process safety program. So here's some examples of some areas where we've intentionally embedded the risk matrix into our tools and those processes to influence the decisions that we make. So work management prioritization. We've embedded our risk framework into there so that we make sure that we are prioritizing those protection systems and other safety critical systems when we're deciding what maintenance to go forward with and where to put our resources, because we certainly don't have unlimited resources. We use it for annual budget investment decision making, right? What are going to be the benefits? What are going to be the risks that we're going to be mitigating? How do these compare? We use it for, we've stood up an electronic risk register in which when we identify risks to our business, we go in and put them in, and again, we assess that against that common risk matrix. Incident management, as we've improved along our incident management journey and our safety journey, more and more incidents are being based and assessed less on their actual impact and way more on their loss potential. So their likely impact. And again, that's very heavily based on making the assessment based on our risk matrix, right? Consequence and probability. Management of change. not just assessing what it is that we're trying to avoid, why we're making the change, right? But the impact that we're trying to avoid or mitigate, but also trying to make sure that we're properly assessing and weighing against that the implications of making the change. So what are the risks of making that change against what we're trying to avoid and the impetus for making the change? So again, we've embedded our risk framework right into there. We've also changed how we go about some of our operating practices, specifically our decision-making around bypasses, forces, jumpers, alarm suppressions, operating limits. We've embedded the risk matrix in there by requiring any of those changes to undergo a management of change first before they're allowed to be implemented, so we fully understand the impact of those decisions. And finally, maintenance strategies, engineering standards. If we make a change to our standards, we again go through that management of change process so we understand those risks that we're bringing into our business or that we're mitigating by making those changes, and also potentially the offsetting costs and other influences that may come in and get impacted by that change to those underlying standards. So a couple lessons learned. I'll cover this off quickly and then I'll pause and see if there's any questions and we can get into a bit of a discussion. So in terms of approach, again, for industries that are sort of medium to lower risk, I really like the framework approach. Obviously, I'm biased because that's the approach we took, but it's worked well for us and it's been very good in terms of sustainment. Measure early before you're ready. So I've talked with some other companies who chose only to measure the processes where they were going to be implementing sort of in the imminent future, or chose not to measure until they'd stood them up and they'd been implemented because, geez, what if we look bad? But it was really important for us and a couple of the other companies that took this approach to be able to paint the picture to try and help create motivation for why we need to go down this journey. Look, these are the barriers that we have, and this is the health of those barriers. And yeah, it's not great right now, but that's why we're on this journey. And then to be able to give those teams that real-time live feedback as they're progressing on the implementation, to be able to see that the work that they were doing was actually helping them to start track towards what our targeted performance was and what our goal was. So that was really important for us. And again, being able to have that automated and visible to everyone. So any employee in our company can go and look at our dashboard and see how every single facility is performing on process safety. That was really key. It made it real, it made it visible, it made it more tangible to people where those risks were and how the work that they were doing was going to help influence that. Performing a gap assessment. So again, no one has unlimited resources. You've got to be strategic about where you go in and make those improvements. Having that map, that heat map at the beginning of our program was incredibly useful in terms of helping us figure out where we wanted to make those investments and how much of a change we need to drive in our program. Again, I can't harp on this one enough. I won't say it too much more, but single common way of making decisions, and that being your risk framework was hugely impactful for us. And then finally, going back to sort of, again, you don't have unlimited resources. You can, especially if you've got a large number of gaps, you're gonna have to focus where to put your time. Again, just a reminder that, invest that time and that effort and that energy, we're gonna have the most impact. So technical barriers tend to be most effective. And that's certainly where we put a huge amount of our initial focus in our program, was making sure that our protection systems and stuff were there and were going to function when they were called upon and that they were reliable. In terms of implementation, this was really key. Investing in change management in order to make these programs live and these changes live on more than just paper. You're changing the behaviors of the teams in the field. And that takes a lot of time and effort and energy, and it really helps to have a change management plan and approach for how you're going to tackle that. Having active leadership and support was hugely important for us again. We had a number of different business challenges come up as we were trying to implement process safety program. And we had to, as an organization, tackle all of them. We had to work our way and find out how and when and where to prioritize different things and how to share those resources. And we wouldn't have been able to keep the focus on ops integrity if we hadn't had that active leadership engagement and support. Again, it's a journey. Take those field teams, those groups, those people that you're going to have to actually change their behavior, bring them along with you on the journey. It makes it so much easier from a change management perspective. They're so much more willing to adopt the change if they understand why they're doing it and they've been a part of having that dialogue. And finally, it's a journey. It's not a project, right? Again, our program was like 26 projects. Doesn't mean that we covered everything. We're still driving improvements across our framework. There were lots of ups and downs and roadblocks. And if we hadn't had people understanding that and being willing to actually recognize that there was going to be challenges and that we just needed to work our way through them, then I don't know that we would have made it through. And on the sustainment side, again, it's a journey to a new way of running your business. So really more that you can do to embed this just as the new way you do your business as opposed to a thing that you do on the side. Again, just talking to other companies and based on our experience, that was hugely, hugely valuable. And we're still doing that. And if you get that in place and this governing the program becomes really governing your business and your organization and how it runs, it makes it a lot easier to drive continuous improvement. And to be able to continue to also make sure that you sustain the benefits that you get, not just from a safety standpoint, but from across your business. So it's really, really important. So that's all I've got to say. That was an awful lot. So I'll stop here and maybe pass it back to you, Sherry, and see if there's some questions.
Thanks, Marina. That was awesome. I cannot believe all that's been done since I left. Oh my God. So I was a big part, Marina and I worked very closely for a couple of years on the very start of that project with pitching it. And I thought it would be really beneficial to hear how they did that and what they're doing with it and the benefits since. So I am going to unmute you all now. And if anyone has any questions for Marina.
Hi, Marina. It's Gordon Murray here from the Wood Pellet Association. That was just a fabulous presentation, and you know, it's amazing to see how much you accomplished there. One of the things. Oh, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, I was getting a bit of feedback here. The way that we're organized is like we've got companies of various capability and size, and smaller organizations won't have the same kind of resources. And I'm just wondering, like from an industry perspective, do you have any advice on how to head an industry rather than just as an individual company, and how we can support the smaller companies in moving ahead with this?
Yeah, it was interesting talking with Scottish Power and learning from their journey, because although they started doing their implementation as an individual company, as their performance started improving, they started getting more industry recognition, and other companies started reaching out, just like frankly we did at TransAlta, to say, hey, how did you do that? Can we come along? Can you help us? Right? And so they did things very similar to what you're doing right now. They came together as an industry group and they built bow ties jointly. They also worked together to try and identify, okay, what would be good practice in terms of implementing those barriers based on type. And the other thing that then allowed them to do was it gave them the flexibility based on the resources that each company had available to go in and then know sort of directionally what they had to get to in terms of good practice, but take their own path to implementing it. So some companies may have had the finances and the resources and the size of organization to validate implementing in tools and systems. Others, it may have been simpler and more cost-effective to achieve the same outcome, but maybe you do it off of Excel spreadsheets and other sort of lower budget approaches and methods. And also to prioritize the investment based on where your individual organization is having the most challenges. So I'd say come together as a group, do the bow ties, which you've already done, work together to help identify what good practice is. That'll help take some of the onus off of the groups. And then each company should go through and either do a self-audit, or maybe you can work through as an industry group to help each other identify where your current state is and help identify where to start picking off driving those improvements, right? Because you're not going to be able to accomplish it all in one big go. There's likely just too much work.
Right. It's like when you see the totality of what you've accomplished, it's quite intimidating actually. And I just look at, as an industry, we need to sort of crawl, walk, and then run, I guess, as a metaphor. And so we've just completed the initial round of bow ties that we thought would be common to all the plants, and then we're trying to train everybody, expose them to resources and experience like you've had, and then make sure we've got resources to put out to the individual companies to try to bring them along, and then at the same time our regulator WorkSafe. I mean, this is a high priority for them, and they're pushing us probably fairly hard, and this is a high priority for us, but I'm not sure that we can keep the pace that WorkSafe is expecting from us. I mean, we both want to get to the same end, but it just seems like there's a lot to do.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend taking a risk-based approach, right? You're not going to get everything done all at once. If you know where you are and you know what parts of your program or your framework are causing the most risk, and if you just follow that simple approach of, technical barriers first, then process, then sort of people, that might be one way of trying to approach it and chunk it out into smaller sort of areas of investment in terms of time and energy.
Yeah. Well, that's good advice.
Yeah, and it'll give you the benefit too on the business side, because you'll have fewer unplanned events and business impacts, but it'll also achieve the improved safety that the regulator is looking for, right?
Right.
Trial.
Any other questions?
Trial.
Oh, sorry. I was muted. I'm just going to mute everyone in between, but are there any other questions for Marina?
Trial.
Well,
this is Blowski at WorkSafe. Thank you very much for the great presentation. Are you aware of a specific sector or group of companies that have adopted the directional method?
Yeah, there's a company that I'm talking with right now in Australia. Actually, I'm going to be in Australia in the next couple of weeks and actually stopping in a meeting with them. They're very decentralized. They're an organization, not an industry group. They're very decentralized in terms of how they run their business. And so that's very much the approach that they've taken. They've said, look, we're going to come in, we're going to identify the bow ties, we're going to identify the barrier types, we're going to set that sort of good practice or minimum expectation, and then it's up to each individual facility to go in and identify, okay, based on where their practices are at, where are they going to focus first, and how they're going to go about meeting that minimum expectation. So from that perspective, they're sort of very decentralized, and then all that they're doing is they're standing up centralized, because they're a company, maybe less of a industry group. They're standing up a KPI measurement dashboard so that they can see how each group is performing. And all they've done is ask them to commit to each business group to go in and identify, okay, over what timeline are you going to drive these improvements, so that then they can just sort of hold them accountable to that timeline. So it's very much the approach that they're taking, and I can sort of see a parallel to industry groups in terms of working together and taking that approach.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Marina. It's Steve Mueller with Pinnacle. Very curious about the dashboard and the metrics. Can you share some of the particular KPIs that are getting tracked in real time on that dashboard in terms of implementation? Are you looking at things like, performing preventive maintenance on, piece of equipment? Like what are the kinds of things that you're actually reporting from a KPI point of view?
Sure. So I'm just going to flip back to that page on the presentation, and granted it's a high-level picture that I've given you, but our KPI dashboard, it reflects the framework that we set up within our facility. So we broke our framework or our barrier types into sort of 8 discrete areas, and our KPI dashboard reflects each of those 8 discrete areas, and then we have KPIs underneath each, which shows what our performance is. So under technical risk management, we've got things like number of engineering standards declared implemented. We've got things like management of change, so some KPIs to try and indicate how well our management of change is working, those types of things. Under safety critical elements, so this is really a measurement of our maintenance execution against our protection systems or our safety critical. And you can see here we've got a maintenance management area, which is sort of doing more of the generic sort of work management type KPIs. How well is our maintenance performing specifically? But then we've created a separate area where we can call out specifically, okay, that's great that we know our maintenance program is in a certain amount of health, but specifically how are our protection systems being managed and maintained? We've got another area that's alarm management. So it's around number of alarms, number of nuisance alarms, number of alarms per shift per operator, that kind of thing, those types of KPIs. And then under document and records control and compliance and audit, we've got things like our operating procedures. Are those document reviews on track, or are they falling behind? Staff competence, are people on top of their training plans and their competency assessments? So those are the types of KPIs that we have stood up.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have any questions?
Oh, sorry, Sherry, it's Steve again. I noticed you're recording the session. I would love to share this with some members of my safety team that aren't on the call. Is it going to be made available to members?
Yeah, that's the plan. So, and thanks again to Marina for agreeing to that. As soon as we get it edited, I'll put it up on our website and then send out a link for everyone.
Fantastic. Great, very good presentation. Thank you.
Marina is the boss. We spend a lot of time together, and it's been really good, Marina, to hear like what you've done with this. And she didn't say much in the beginning, but she did a major pitch. So one of the things that I learned through the process was what she said about getting leaders engaged in this. So she did a very good job of letting leaders know why this is what we needed to do, and the pitch was really good, and the time was right, and yeah, so she was part of all of that work. And from what I understand now, the governance and sustainment, she's got a lot of those responsibilities as well.
Yep, they're mine.
Yeah,
I put it in. I get to own it now.
It's really generous of Marina to spend her time, to give us this presentation. The information is fantastic, and Sherry, I don't know if you talked to Marina, but it would sure be nice if we could get Marina to come and do this again at our annual safety conference in Prince George in June.
Yeah, we have talked about it, and she is going to be there. So
oh, great.
We'll figure out what the messaging and stuff will be, because it is a huge undertaking, but obviously it's possible. And I'd really like and we'll talk to this group a little bit later, but establishing like what kind of approach to take as an industry, I think it's really key. Like that directional approach makes a lot of sense for me in terms of trying to leverage and, the group as a whole to develop a set of standards that each company will go back and be responsible for implementing. I love the idea of possibly a set of KPIs that we can all kind of steward to and then report on. I know that was something that came up at the end of last year with this group, is how do we make sure that things that we're implementing and doing are going to we're able to sustain itself. But everyone is a different company, so there needs to be a certain level of autonomy. But I think leveraging each other's strengths and being able to build standards for some of these critical controls and the risks that have been identified will be huge. So with that, look, it's almost right on time, Marina.
Like we planned it.
Just like we planned it. So if anyone else has any, Shab just asked a question. Has this system had an impact on TransAlta's decision on building future assets, coal versus natural gas?
So it hasn't influenced what type of assets we're going to build, but we have been starting to use this and really influence the growth. So actually, we're just bringing in a new technology into our business right now, some battery storage, which is pretty exciting. And as I worked with the growth team, we actually went in and proactively built the bow ties before we moved into the construction and final design phase. And that really helped us to, one, understand what kind of asset we're going to be bringing in and how we might need to go about operationalizing that, but also allowed us to understand if there were some small adjustments that we wanted to make sure that process safety was there before we committed to final design and construction. And it helped us to actually bring together the operations team, the growth team, our third-party engineering firm, and our OEM, so manufacturer. So everyone could really come together and understand what this future asset was going to look like and how it would need to run.
Nice. Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Marina. So I'll be in touch to help coordinate for that conference. Thanks to everyone on the call, and we will be making this available by recording. And yeah, so thanks again.
You're welcome. Thank you.